from the News Channel 5 Network, this is OpenLine.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to OpenLine. So glad you are with us tonight. We are talking about what a lot of people are talking about. President Biden has mandated vaccines for American workers. He says our patience is wearing thin with those who are not getting vaccinated. So now anybody working for a company with more than 100 employees must get vaccinated, or the company will be required to do weekly testing. At least that's what the president has put forward. How will that work? Is it legal? That's what we want to talk about tonight. We want to hear from you. Certainly, I'm sure you have opinions. We want to hear from you. We also want to talk with MTSU professor, Dr. John Weil. Dr. Weil, thank you for being here. You're also the Dean of the Honors College that we see there behind you there. So, again, happy to have you here, MTSU political science professor. All right, you heard what the president said in his speech. The big question is does he have the authority to mandate this? What do you think?
Try to prohibit their children from getting medical treatments, and the courts have stepped in and acted on their behalf. But, you know, if it's federal employees, I think the president can do it.
But this goes way beyond federal employees. And initially he steered away from saying, he initially said he wasn't going to mandate vaccines, but now he's all in and he's clearly frustrated. Are you surprised he took this step? Are you surprised? What do you think?
No, I mean, it's one of these where whatever you do, you're going to get fire from both sides. I think that most people, Democrat and Republican, anticipated that COVID would be largely conquered by this time. We actually, we had very good progress on getting, a fair number of people vaccinated, and then we sort of hit a plateau. And, hospitals still report being full. The problem, of course, is there's so many children, prior to 12 years old, most of them cannot get the vaccine. And so an adult who's not vaccinated could possibly, spread it to them. And, as we go back to school in person versus online, it makes the threat somewhat larger. We had something similar in the civil rights era where, one of the first things that Harry Truman did to promote desegregation was to mandate desegregation in the armed forces. And then, when we got aid to schools, federal government took over, if you want aid, you have to be open both to whites and blacks. So there is some precedent for this, but I was on a panel over a year ago where we were talking about the federal dimension of this problem. And not only do you have the president versus other branches of government, but within states. I mean, you have a lot of Republican governors who are attempting to prohibit mask wearing. And that doesn't seem, to me, it doesn't seem very Republican, because Republicans are usually for local control. But, you know, there's a saying in political science that our view on federalism often depends on whether our ox is being gored. So if we have a government, you know, if we favor vaccines and our governor favors vaccines, we say, yeah, go ahead and make a mandate. If we're opposed to vaccines, we'll say, well, the governor has no business with this, or the school board doesn't have any business, depending on what side we happen to be on.
Which is what we're hearing from Republicans now. They say this is not appropriate. The president's overstepping his bounds, and they're promising challenges to this. And so my question to you as a political science professor, when will we know? So let's say this is challenged. How quickly could this be shot down? Or could it be upheld? Now, President Biden is saying, bring it on. I mean, he's basically saying, yeah, you want to challenge it? Go right ahead. I think this is rock solid. I have every right to do this. Others are saying, no, you're way overstepping your bounds. When are we going to know?
It's a good question. You know, one could argue that the referendum in California, the recall in California yesterday, was something of a referendum on this issue. There you had a governor who took a pretty firm stand on, you know, getting vaccinated, and received criticism, but was able to get almost, I think, a 2-to-1 margin in favor of retaining him. Now, there were other issues, including, you know, the competence of the person who would have replaced him. I think what we're going to see initially is what we're seeing right now is, and I think even within Tennessee, and it may have changed over the last day or two, but Memphis resisted the governor's orders and required masks in the schools, and a judge there has upheld them. I believe that Davidson County has largely ignored the governor's order here, and I could be wrong on this, but I believe
no, you're absolutely right. In schools they have, right. Yes, you're right.
And ordered them, and, you know, so far no one has taken them into court. Now you go down to Florida, and you have this, you know, DeSantis is saying, if you mandate masks, I'm going to take money away from school teachers, and Biden is saying, "Don't worry, I'll pay the difference." So often, what will happen, you know, the U.S. is divided. Obviously, well, we're divided into U.S. district courts, and then you have a series of 11, 12 U.S. circuit courts, and sometimes you'll get a ruling from one circuit that's at odds with another. And it's often only when that happens that the Supreme Court says, well, maybe it's time for us to intervene. It could clearly go on for several months.
This could go on for several months. Meanwhile, it's interesting how President Biden is doing this. And so what he's doing is going through the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, OSHA. And right. What do you think about that? So he's saying OSHA can draft rules requiring businesses that employ more than 100 people, telling them that employees have to be vaccinated, and if they're not vaccinated, then they have to test weekly. Do you think again, I guess this gets back to that central question, and is that the right way to do this? Is this an appropriate use of OSHA, you know, the Department of Labor? What do you think?
Well, I mean, the advantage of it, I guess, from Biden's perspective, is you're actually acting, you know, presidential powers are usually larger if they are directed in pursuit of legislation. And to the extent that, you know, Congress has legislated, created this bureau, then it makes, you know, it's not just the president. The president is acting on authority that he thinks the laws give him. There's an interesting argument if you look at the statements of Ava Hutchinson, who's the governor of Arkansas. And you remember Arkansas passed an early prohibition against mask wearing. He signed it, and a couple months later he said, I had no idea it was going to have this impact. I've changed my mind. I want the state to do otherwise. But as I understand it, he opposes Biden's mask mandate because he thinks that it's actually going to bring more, you know, it's going to get people's backs up more than it is getting compliance. You know, people feel like they're, you know, the government's railroading it into something that, you know, a lot of people, I believe incorrectly, believe is unsafe for them.
Yeah. And President Biden is being criticized by some for not going far enough. They want him to go even farther. And so
Yes.
as I was reading where he could go, he could mandate vaccines for international or even interstate travel.
Right.
He hadn't done that, but there's some that are pushing him to do that. What do you think about that?
Well, again, you know, this follows, in some ways, it follows a lot of what happened during the Civil Rights era. You know, we forget that the major Civil Rights Act, which is the Civil Rights Act of 64 and then the Voting Rights Act of 65, but the Civil Rights Act of 64 was actually justified not under the 14th Amendment Equal Protection Clause. It was justified under the Interstate Commerce Clause, that we had the right to keep commerce free of discrimination. And in this case, in some ways, you could argue that the argument is even stronger in that, you know, there is actually a if you believe that not being vaccinated can lead to greater disease, you're actually protecting the public who are after all, you know, you're in a confined space. If you're in an airplane or a bus, if you're in your own private car, that might be a little bit more problematic, but certainly in matters of public transportation, you could make the legal argument.
Yeah, and it's so interesting. I mean, President Biden said the anger you see on television toward flight attendants and others doing their job, he's talking about the mask, is wrong, it's ugly. He's saying if you break the rules, be prepared to pay, and by the way, show some respect. The division that we're seeing in this country over this, I mean, we were clearly divided, but here we have a pandemic, and we can't even agree on that. And so I ask you as a political science professor, studier of this, are you surprised by the level here of division, or are you not surprised? Is this precedented in history?
You know, for better or worse, this became, I mean, it's odd. You know, President Trump did push very strongly to get the vaccines done, but then sort of took the side of you can't force anybody to do this. And so it became a partisan issue. Frankly, I would hate to see an argument right now in the Congress of the United States or in any school boards over what color carpet to put in. We are just, we are so, at one another. And I would say, whatever your viewers, whatever they think about this, please don't take it out on a flight attendant. And I mean, what I try to do, and it's hard sometimes because I have strong opinions on this, but I try to assume the good faith of people who believe differently than I do. And if we recognize them as fellow American, they're not Chinese communists or, Russian revolutionaries. They're our kin. They're our fellow citizens. And again, if you don't like mandates, and that's what Biden is doing, then by all means, don't vote for it. Don't vote for people he supports. But by the same token, I mean, what we had in California, you wonder if Newsom would have won or would have done worse if Trump hadn't been in the conversation. If it were just, is Newsom doing a good job or bad, instead of, do you want to support the National Republican line or you want to support the National Democratic line? Well, in California, Democrats 2-1 over Republicans.
And do you think that's where we are now? Again, as a political science professor, is the Republican line against vaccines? I mean, and skeptical of vaccines, I guess, or I guess they're against mandates. But here we have a public health crisis. That's what the experts say. Now, I've had people on this show who disagree, and I guess, everybody can have their right to disagree. But experts say we're in a public health crisis, a pandemic, thousands are dying. It's a fact. And is it, if you want to boil it down to nuts and bolts politics here, is this the Republican Party are they going to go on this hill and fight? And do you think it's a winning fight if they oppose this?
It wasn't a winning fight in California. But then again, California is a much bluer state than Tennessee is. I don't think by any means that all Republicans or all Democrats are united on this. I've seen people on both sides who, have different views of coronavirus. I do think, though, that I think there was a better hill probably to stake the future of the Republican Party on than anti-vaccine. Now, that being said, nobody likes to be told what to do, but the irony is, both sides, I think, have certainly claimed that rights go with responsibilities, but that's typically more a Republican theme than it is a Democratic theme. And right now, the Republicans, the anti-vaxxers seem to be on that side of we have rights and that's the end of it, as opposed to we have children who need protected. We have healthcare workers who are overwhelmed. We have hospitals that cannot accept people with heart attacks and appendicitis attacks because they're too busy caring for people, a majority of whom have not been vaccinated.
We saw the Republican senator from Tennessee, Haggerty, sent out a news release that I saw. And he said, this is a clear overreach by Biden. It's unacceptable what he's doing. It's an overreach. He started by saying, I have been vaccinated. I have made the choice, the personal choice to be vaccinated. But it's a decision between me and my doctor, and everybody should make that decision between, them and their doctor. And what the president's doing is an overreach. When you hear that, what do you think?
Well, I would say that it's a comparable overreach for a state governor. We got 95 counties in Tennessee, and a governor is going to tell people in 95 counties that they cannot require masks. If they have 50% infection rates, can they do it? And, in terms of the other, I agree. If this were a matter that purely involved individual choice, that would be one thing. But we got a large population out there, of children who are under 12 years old. And we have, if there's any responsibility we have as adults, it's protecting children. Now, that being said, I fully understand that some people, don't believe that vaccinations work, and that there are arguments that you can make against that, but it's not just individual choice, it affects other people.
And looking back at history, we have the Spanish flu.
Yes.
Have you studied there wasn't a vaccine for the Spanish flu, that didn't happen, but it kind of just went away, I guess, after 2 years. I think it was like 2 years where we had shutdowns.
Yes.
What can we learn? Was there this kind of division, first off? And is there anything we can learn from how that manifested itself and what we are seeing now?
Let me give a shout out. We have someone on our campus, Dr. Katie Foss, who's in the mass media and entertainment, who has done a book on epidemics in U.S. history. And she knows this, much more than I do. I do know that often public health measures take some time. I was listening to someone yesterday who's done a study of longevity in American history, and he said for many years one of the greatest threats to young people was drinking milk. And even after Louis Pasteur said you can pasteurize milk and make it safe, there were a lot of people, including my own family when I was growing up, who did not pasteurize milk. So and one of the things about, the vaccines right now, as I understand it, the J&J vaccine has followed sort of the traditional, vaccine making regimen. The other two are done from a different process. It's been studied. They've been working on it for 40 years. But this is the first time, as I understand it, it was done, in a vaccine that's widely available. So all of us all people my age are a little resistant to change, right? It's new, but think of the times when I was growing up in the 1950s and 60s. The polio vaccine was something we all sort of rallied around. we had seen children in iron lungs and, people that were lame, and it was almost biblical. People are rising up. And for whatever reason, we don't seem to have that in the situation here. The other example I could give you is, the space program. Once Sputnik went up, maybe that's what we need, is a competition with some other power but we were all behind the space race, even when we had the Challenger disastrous. Let's get back in there. Let's show that we're at the forefront of science. And right now, we seem to be lagging pretty far behind.
Very interesting. All right, we are going to take a break, and then I'll stop asking questions, and we want to hear from you. There are a couple people on the line, but we have plenty of lines open. There is the phone number, 615-737-PLUS, 615-737-7587. Take a break. We'll hear from you right after this.